Hi everybody, just a starting note. This is a short video designed for real estate management students studying valuation. It's intended for quick revision as part of academic studies. So if anybody dropping randomly onto this video, they might find the following material a little bit strange if you're looking at it out of context, a little bit confusing. So what I'm going to be doing now is looking at the comparative method. Has other names. In the UK tradition, it's probably the most commonly used method of valuation. If we look at the US way of doing things, where there are three approaches, then we would say that this is the same as a sales comparison approach, also known as the market approach. We also use this method to think about rental value in the UK and what a property might let for. So personally, I prefer to avoid the term sales. After the session, I expect that you should be able to define this method, its limitations, that is the drawbacks, its pros and cons, as well as knowing when it's most suitable for use. So really, we have to start by thinking that the value of property is dependent on two factors, the demand and supply. And if we assume that these are constant, so that any one time the number of persons able and willing to purchase a property is equal to the number of persons who desire to sell, i.e. that these two figures are the same, then we will have a steady market and a stable price level. We also can maybe assume that if a house was sold last week for, let's say, €160,000, then an identical house that is offered for sale now, we might also expect that that would sell for the same. You know, if they're the same €160,000, assuming they're in the same location and they're of the same quality, standard of build, and the same condition. Okay, and the market therefore generally finds its level of price. If we assume that there's no changes that affect the market, then the second house we would expect to achieve that €160,000 on the market. When we consider a property to value, we need to look at those recent sales and consider the substitution value. That is what based on the idea that somebody would not pay more than what they can to get for, or what they can buy for an equivalent price nearby. Okay, or what they would pay for a similar property nearby. What's also important to know here, to remember, is that a few scattered sales are not enough. The more relevant the transactional evidence, the more that we have, the more reliable will be our valuation. Now, as we say before, the real world isn't simple. We have to remember that supply and demand are not constant. Houses are usually only offered when somebody wants to move. New houses might come onto that market as builders complete new schemes, and this also affects supply in another irregular way. Demand fluctuates with population movement. You have new household formation. Divorces might create demand for twice as many houses, or families coming together. Level of wages, availabilities of loans, price of loan, as in the cost of borrowing, etc. All these things change, and therefore we say that the price of property is never constant. Okay. Prices of property is also influenced by your own consideration. You know, a property might have a special attraction for somebody who bought it. The price might therefore have been higher than under normal conditions. Okay, we have to remember that also that no two properties are identical. Considerable differences in size, shape, layout, condition are commonplace, and the locational advantages can change even within the same street. You know, one side of the street might have an attractive aspect over some fields, another side might look over some neighbouring houses or some industrial or some sort of less desirable view. Okay. An experienced valuer will recognise these differences between properties and make all those necessary adjustments. When would they use the method? Well, typically freehold, leasehold, residential properties is probably the most common here in the UK, both with vacant possession and occupied. And it's also used as a starting point for the other various valuation methods, and also as a final stage, often to check other methods. We can also use it for land, I guess. We can use it for commercial property as well. But mostly in these examples, I'm looking at the basic residential property valuation. What's important, yeah, as I mentioned, that the valuer appraiser has to look at the whole global or the whole local national market, look at the economic factors, how's law changing, the mortgage interest rates that I mentioned before, etc. This is when you look at both the transactional evidence and the time of valuation. It might have been some time has passed between the evidence that you've looked at and the property you have to value. So, yeah, you have to look at the direct comparison, looking at properties, looking at comparable properties, look at the transactions, and you have to consider how similar those properties are physically. And also geographically, are they close to your subject? Are they far away? What about a similar legal interest? That is, are they both freehold title or is one held on leasehold? And how that would affect what the market would pay. Do you have sufficient records of similar transactions? You may not. Your evidence may be poor. You may have to look at offer prices or try to find some other way to determine the market value. And you also have to think, is that property market stable? If you're in a market where prices are rising, you may have to take that into account, or rather the valuer definitely will have to take that into account. So other examples, really, I think the ones that, in my experience, usually drive value would be age and condition. You look at your comparable properties, are they of a similar quality to what we're trying to value? If you have a sale of, let's imagine, a house next door to a house that you want to value, but the house that's sold was in a far worse condition, and you know the price that property sold for, then you might have to think, well, how much more would this subject property that I'm trying to value, how much more would that sell for? Architectural styles can be different. You give sometimes you'll find, particularly in the UK, lots of old estates where properties look identical, but it's not always the case. We have to think about not just the size of the property itself, but also the plot. Maybe if we have some evidence of a 3-bedroom house, 2 living rooms in good condition with a large garden, and it has sold in a stable market directly to a property which we want to value, and that subject property that we want to value is smaller, perhaps it has 2 bedrooms, then we can probably safely assume that our property would be less attractive than the one that is sold, and the value that it would achieve must be a bit lower. And I'll have some practical examples in the next session for you to see the sort of thought process behind this. Finally, I think the position within the neighbourhood of the property. You get various advantages and disadvantages. In the UK, for example, neighbourhoods with good schools are very attractive, and you'll see that has a marked effect on property values. Again, a property looking over some green area might also be more attractive in the market, as opposed to one that is maybe looking not over a park or green area or countryside, but over just some industrial or commercial zones. So in summary, this method is the most widely used method of valuation, at least in the UK. It is very highly dependent on evidence, and therefore that drawback is going to be what happens when the evidence we have is poor. Now, when I was younger, I remember when my first job, I could never use the excuse. I was told I could never use the excuse that there's no evidence. There's always evidence. It just may not be of a good quality, but we have to find that evidence and start to use it, start to interpret it. We can also break down the price into units to allow us to account for variables. For example, if we're going to look at a shop property on a high street and we want to value another shop property nearby, or we have evidence of a shop property nearby and they're different sizes, we can try and work out on a per square foot or per square basis the value of that other property and apply it to ours. Doesn't really work so well with residential markets. In some places, you know, New York, Dubai, you see these places seem to work on a per square foot basis. In the UK, we tend to think about the amount of bedrooms, whether they're double bedrooms or single bedroom basis. Important thing is that the valuer's opinion is subjective and based on their experience and on their knowledge of the market. And but they will use that and they'll look and they will also observe the market to try and arrive at their opinion of value. And if anybody wants to look at a bit more advice on this, particularly my students, or I guess students studying any real estate management program, the RICS have published, just a couple of years ago, in October 2019, a guide for using comparable evidence in real estate valuation. Thank you for listening.